Anyway, it's great to be with you, and as he said, I flew up from Alabama yesterday, and coming into North Dakota, I thought maybe a great new motto for the state might be wide open spaces and wide open faces. But we're relatively mask-free in Alabama, but not completely. Anyway, I'm up here for several reasons. For one thing, we have a Lutherans for Life regional conference that's going to be taking place in Fargo tomorrow. You're all invited. I do have to tell you that there is a registration cost of $50 per person, and I believe it's $25 for students. But there are schedules for it and back. And I don't know if any of you know Chris Brademeyer. He is a Missouri Synod pastor in, I believe it's Oaks. He'll be one of the speakers, and I'll be speaking at 10:30. And there are several others on the schedule, as you can see. But if you can come up tomorrow, I think you'd find it very enjoyable and very informative as well. And I think you'd find Lutherans for Life to be a group that would stand for the things that you definitely believe in. But for tonight, we're going to be talking about two things in two different sessions, although they're very closely related. One, to give us a biblical perspective on how a believer should respond when he's living in a pagan or secular or anti-Christian environment. We're going to look to a model, and that model is a young boy who he was raised in a pious home. This actually happened, believe it or not. And then some soldiers knocked on the door, and they took him from his parents, took him to a city of the East, put him through 3 years of indoctrination and pagan New Age philosophy, and prepared him to be a servant of the New World Order. This actually happened. It was in 605 BC, and it was in Jerusalem, and the young man we're talking about was Daniel. And we'll take a look at Daniel, and then after we take a break, then the next topic is going to be something to the effect of, why can I riot, but I can't worship? What's going on in America today? And we'll be looking not only at what the courts have been saying in regard to the freedom of worship that has been limited in some cases, but we're also going to be looking at the mentality that we have with the Antifa group, the Black Lives Matter, and things like terms that you probably haven't heard before, but I'm going to try to expose you to them so that when you hear them on television, you'll understand what they mean, like woke theology and intersectionality and critical theory and things like this. And if you don't understand how people can say that saying all lives matter is racist, but saying Black Lives Matter is not racist, well, what I'm hoping that I'll be able to do tonight is show you where those ideas are coming from so that you will be able to understand them, and so you'll be able to deal with them. But first, let's get this background with the book of Daniel. As I say, Daniel was a pious young man raised in a Jewish home in Jerusalem, and in 605 BC, when King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon conquered Jerusalem, he took Daniel and his 3 friends and some others as well, possibly about 200 according to Jewish tradition, some of the best young men from noble families from Jerusalem, and took them to Babylon. Part of the reason was to make them as hostages to ensure that the Jews back in Jerusalem did not revolt, although they did anyway. Part of it was to prepare them to be loyal servants of the new Babylonian Empire, because that was the philosophy of Babylon. The idea of the Babylonian Empire was to break down all distinctions among the subject people and destroy their religions, their languages, their customs, and the like, make them all into good, loyal servants of the new Babylonian Empire. Now, these young men, as we read in Daniel chapter 1, were given very favorable treatment by the world standards. They were put up in the visiting officer quarters, and they were fed Chateaubriand, the king's meat, and the king's wine, the best diet from a Babylonian standpoint that you could imagine. but it violated their Jewish convictions. And so we're going to see as we look to Daniel, first of all, here in Daniel chapter 1, starting with verse 8, that Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Well, we're going to go on in just a little bit, but I might say that we're going to find what happens to Daniel here. Daniel is going to grow up. He is going to be the valedictorian of his class. He is going to be found to be wiser than all of the magicians and astrologers and the other great men of the realm. In fact, he'll be called the master of the magi, the master of the magicians. And he will be a judge in Babylon. We'll read that he sat in the gate, which is a term meaning he served as a judge because that's where the court sat. And further, that he served as a prime minister under Nebuchadnezzar, an advisor under Belshazzar, and then after the Persians take over, we'll find he becomes a high official under King Darius in the Persian government. But at the same time, we're going to see that there are going to be times when Daniel clashes with civil authority. And we're going to see how he handles those clashes, because the day may be coming when we'll be facing clashes too. And as Lutherans, of course, we believe that God has established two kingdoms, church and state, and that each of these kingdoms has a special role, but that when we obey the state, we do so only when the state commands what is consistent with what God has commanded. And as some of our founding fathers would say, rebellion against tyrants is obedience to God. And Peter and the other disciples said almost the exact same thing in Acts chapter 5 and verse 9, Acts 5:29, when they said, we ought to obey God rather than men. But Daniel tries to be a good servant of civil government, but when he can't, then he has to stand for God first. So let's see this first clash. The first clash is that Daniel and his friends have been given a diet that contradicts the Jewish diet. And so we read in verse 8, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore, what did he do? He requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. The term for that is captain of the guard. In other words, first thing we notice here is that Daniel has the respect of those who they have found him to be a truthful person, a man of integrity, a young man of integrity. He's probably only 13 or 14 at this time, but they find that he's not a troublemaker, one that just looks for things to complain about. And so already he has their respect. When you have the respect of those in government, that makes it a lot easier for you to deal with them when you come into a clash. And so when Daniel comes to the captain of the guard, he doesn't just say, I'm not going to eat your pagan slop. Rather, he makes a polite request that they be exempted from the Jewish diet. Now we read in verse 10 then that the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink, for why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are your sort? Then shall you make me endanger my head to the king. Notice what Daniel does now. He listens to the captain of the guard to understand his point. When we're in a clash with civil authority, we need to listen to them, understand what their concerns are. And so the captain of the guard is saying, look, Daniel, I like you, but I'm responsible to the king for your health. And if I let you go back on that awful Jewish diet, well, you might get sick. And then I might lose my job. In fact, I might even lose my head. So look what Daniel does now. Verse 11, then said Daniel to Melzar, that's the captain of the guard, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and then let them give us pulse to drink or to eat, and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portions of the king's meat. And as thou seest, deal with thy servants. So he's saying, look, let's try a test. Put us on our Jewish diet for only 10 days. I mean, we can't get too sick in 10 days, can we? And then compare us to the ones that are on the regular royal diet, and then judge for yourself. And the captain of the guard agrees, and at the end of the time, Daniel and his friends are the healthiest of all, and so they are allowed to continue. So the first clash with authority, Daniel succeeds in working out his conflict. But now we're going to see another clash in verse 3, or chapter 3, that what we've seen here now in chapter 2 is that King Nebuchadnezzar has had this dream of a great image, and his royal cabinet cannot interpret the dream. You notice how his royal cabinet is brought in verse 2 of chapter 2. Then the king commanded that the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers of the Chaldeans to show the king his dreams. Those are the wise men of Babylon. That's the king's royal cabinet. The secretary of magic, the secretary of sorcery, the secretary of soothsaying, and so on. Those are considered the intelligentsia of the time. And they can't interpret the king's dream. And so the king orders they all be executed, but Daniel can. Actually, Daniel would disagree with me when I said that. He would say, I can't interpret this, but there is a God in heaven who can, and I can pray to God and ask him to give me the interpretation, and he does. Again, Daniel manages to work out his difference with authority. But then in chapter 3, now when Daniel has interpreted that dream and said that the head of this image, the head of gold, that represents Babylon, well, pardon the pun, but that went to Nebuchadnezzar's head. That's all he heard. And so the whole rest of the image in chapter 3 is all gold. And everyone is commanded to bow down and worship. This is simply the pagan view of state worship and emperor worship, the view in which the king is considered to be a god, or at least to have a little divine DNA in him somewhere. But everyone is to fall down and worship. Daniel is not mentioned in chapter 3. Perhaps he's out on business with the empire somewhere. But his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refuse to fall down and worship the image. And as a result, they are to be cast into the fiery furnace. And when the king gives them a second chance, maybe you didn't really understand my order. I mean, after all, you are Jews. Maybe you didn't get what I was saying. We'll try it again, this matter. And a good translation to that is, we are not afraid to answer thee. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. Now, I've heard people say that is the strongest statement of faith in the entire Old Testament. I respectfully disagree. I suggest to you that the strongest statement is in the next verse, verse 18, where they say, but if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Yes, we know God is able to deliver us, and yes, we believe he will deliver us, but even if he doesn't, we are still going to follow him, and we will not disobey him by worshiping your golden image. And so they are placed in the fiery furnace. There is a fourth man in the fiery furnace who I believe to be the Son of God, and as a result, they are delivered. And then in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar has another dream, at the close of which, a year later, he is placed in a state of insanity, judged by God, and insane for 7 years. He is deprived of his kingdom. And then at the end of the 7-year period, his reason returns to him because, as he said, I lifted up mine eyes unto the heaven. He finally acknowledged God. Now, at this time, his reason returns, his kingdom returns, and is greater than ever. But before that, he had simply thought that this God of the Jews was a pretty remarkable God. After all, if he can have people as fine as Daniel working for him, he must be a good God. And if he can interpret dreams that all my advisors can't, this must be a very special God. And if he can deliver people from a fiery furnace, that's especially remarkable. But only after he is actually hit over the head and driven into insanity, only then does he finally acknowledge that God is the true God. And only at this point is he ready to acknowledge that, in verse 37, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth, and his ways judgment, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase. Finally, Nebuchadnezzar bows before God, and I believe Nebuchadnezzar did become a believer at that point. But he died, and then his grandson becomes king, Belshazzar, and Belshazzar has all but forgotten the godliness of his grandfather, but he holds this great feast in which they commit the ultimate sacrilege, taking the sacred vessels of Jerusalem and using those for toasts to the pagan gods. And I think you know the story. The result of all this is that the handwriting comes in the wall, and again, Belshazzar's advisors can't read it, but Daniel can. And the result of all this, the Babylonian Empire fades into history, because that very night, the rising power, the Persian Empire, takes over. And Cyrus the Great of Persia becomes the emperor, and as emperor, he appoints his uncle Darius to become king over Babylon. And so we move to chapter 6. And here in chapter 6, we see that Darius, following what was the standard Persian method of government, decentralization, setting things up in various districts and departments, he set over the kingdom 120 princes over different provinces within the kingdom, and there are one prince over each of these, and then over these he sets 3 presidents. And Daniel is the first of the 3 presidents. And we read in verse 6 that Daniel is preferred above the others because an excellent spirit was in him, and Darius thought to set him over the whole realm. In other words, he was going to make him prime minister over everything. Daniel probably already had some experience being prime minister. I suggest to you that during that 7 years when King Nebuchadnezzar was in a state of insanity, who was that would have held the Babylonian Empire together during that time, but do so in Nebuchadnezzar's name? I think the only person that would have the character and the humility to do that would have been Daniel. And I suggest that during those 7 years, Daniel was actually running the Babylonian Empire. But now it's history. Now we're under Persia, and King Darius wants to make him prime minister over his entire government there in Persia. But there are some who don't like that idea, namely the other presidents and the other princes. And so they decide, we're going to put together a conspiracy here. And they consult among themselves, and they decide, well, let's see if we can find anything wrong Daniel's done. If we can find him in a scandal, then we can get rid of him, or we can show that he's done something incompetently. And so they check through all of his business records. They check every expense account that he's ever filed. They check his phone bill to see if he's been making personal calls and charging them to the empire. They even checked the copy machine to see whether he's been making personal copies at the emperor's expense. But they can't find where he's done anything wrong. They say that he's been professional and he's been excellent. And so they say in verse 5, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Now, what they mean by this is that because he has conducted himself with professionalism and excellence, the only way we're ever going to get at Daniel is if we can manipulate him into a position where he has to choose between obeying God and obeying man. And so here's the way we're going to do it. They get together a decree, and they present that decree to King Darius. They say in verse 7, all the presidents of the kingdom, the governors and the princes, the counselors and the captains have consulted together. Now that is a flat-out lie. They haven't all consulted together. Daniel obviously hasn't, and he's the first of the presidents. How many others weren't consulted? And that's one thing. Always be careful when you hear, we've all agreed. All of who? Or when you hear, all scholars agree. What they mean is a few guys that went to school with me agree. So be careful of that phrase. But anyway, they've agreed that Darius should take an order and sign it, an order that would say that for the next 30 days, everybody should make every request only of the king, not requesting anything else of any man or of any god. And anyway, so Darius signs the order. Now we read in verse 10, when Daniel knew that the order was signed, and Daniel, by the way, by this time is at least 80 years old. He's not some young kid, these artist conceptions of this young boy with blonde hair there, lying there in these lions and so on. This doesn't fit the chronology here. He has to be at least 80 by this time. But so he's a seasoned statesman. He knows what's going on, and the word here that says he knew what was going on means thorough knowledge. He not only knew of the order, he knew the motive behind it. He went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed, and gave thanks before his God, as he did aforetime. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying. He knew they would. He knew they were watching. You know, Daniel could have thought, hey, I don't need this kind of hassle right now. I'm 80, 2 more years and I can retire and get out of this madness. I'll just keep my doors closed and pray, and Darius likes me and he's not going to believe anything against me if they don't have any eyewitnesses. I can get out of it that way. But no, he disobeys openly with his windows open, and he disobeys following a long-established custom, something he'd done all along. Daniel's not looking for an occasion of disobedience. You know, there are people who look for opportunities to get in trouble with government, it seems. They look for clashes. If there's an order that comes down from the city council saying nobody can witness or hand out tracts in the city park, we all say we must obey God rather than men and rush down to the city park to get ourselves arrested. The fact that none of us have done this for the last 50 years doesn't seem to make any difference. We're looking for a chance to be martyrs. Daniel is not looking for a chance to be a martyr. Daniel, rather, is being faithful to the custom that he has followed all along. Well, we read further that when the king hears they've caught Daniel, now he knows what's going on. He knows what's behind this. Well, now he's laboring until the going down of the sun to deliver Daniel. What he's doing here is he's searching over the statutes, trying to find any loopholes in them, perhaps checking past cases. Maybe he sends off a wire to the Persian Supreme Court, consults the Babylonian Attorney General, and repeatedly as he's doing this, they are telling him, O king, know that the law of the Medes and the Persians is that no decree nor statute which the king established may be changed. This is the difference between Persian law and the law of most totalitarian societies. Persians were actually a Western society, and they understood, in the early days of the empire at least, that while the king was appointed by God, the king was not God himself. And the king may speak for God, but he wasn't God, and so his orders actually came from a higher source than himself, and so the king was under the law, not over it. When we say, as John Adams said, that the definition of a republic is an empire of laws and not of men, where even the president is subject to law, that's a concept that we get at least from the Persians, and they're sound on that. Now Daniel, or Darius now knows, I can't repeal this order. I signed it, and under Persian law it stands. If this had been Nebuchadnezzar would have said, I signed an idiot order like that, that order is hereby repealed. Darius can't do that because Persian law is different. And so he says to Daniel, thy God whom thou servest continually will deliver thee. I'm not sure how much conviction he had when he said that, but he placed Daniel in the den of lions. The next morning he returns to the den and says, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God whom thou servest continually able to deliver thee from the lions? That's not the question. The question is he willing to? Of course he's able to. But notice, Daniel doesn't say, you stupid jerk, you shouldn't have put me in here. He says, O king, live forever. My God hath sent his angel. And the angel has stopped the lions' mouths. And as a result, although Darius' testimony at this point is not as strong as Nebuchadnezzar's had been, I think we still see good indication here that Darius as well became a believer through the influence of Daniel. Here is this young Jewish boy, probably anticipated at the age of 14 that he was going to grow up and marry a nice Jewish girl and have a nice Jewish family and maybe someday sit on the Council of 70 Elders, which became the Sanhedrin, and be influential there in Jerusalem. I doubt that he ever imagined that he would influence the course of two great empires, in their turn the greatest empires in the world, with the possible exception of the Chinese, which probably would have given them some good competition. Didn't realize that he would be serving as a model here for believers for centuries and millennia to come. And yet we see how God used Daniel in this way. And what we see out of him, I think, on this issue about when government commands what the Word of God forbids, or forbids what the Word of God commands, we do as Daniel did. First of all, we work out our conflict with authority if possible. And also, we conduct ourselves in such a way that they personally respect us. And that makes it easier for us to deal with them when conflict arises. And I might say, as far as working out conflict with authority, that here in a country like ours, where we elect our leaders, and we have some say in what our country is doing, and even more so in what our state and our county and our local community is doing, the responsibility to try to work out our differences in a society like ours is probably even greater than it was in an undemocratic country like Babylon or Persia. But when we have a clash with authority and the clash can't be worked out, we obey God first. And when we have to choose between obeying man and obeying God, we obey God. And as we do that, first of all, we don't hide our disobedience. We disobey openly. We also disobey respectfully. When we disobey, we expect to be punished. The old saying, if you can't do the time, don't do the crime. Well, that doesn't mean if you have some constitutional defenses, you shouldn't raise them. But recognize that if you disobey, you may have to be punished, and be ready to bear that. And throughout any such crisis, we trust God. Well, I'm going to go into some other matters here in a little bit, but we've gone for a little bit more than a half hour. Why don't I just take a couple of questions, then we'll have a break, and then we'll come back to see what's going on today. So, any questions before we go on a break? Any questions specifically about Daniel or about any other passages in Scripture where we see people that are in conflict with government? We see numerous occasions where Paul is in conflict, likewise Peter, other disciples. I'll be speaking for a Lutherans for Life conference tomorrow, and when I'm at this conference, I'm probably not going to get into this issue, but I'll be reminded there in Exodus chapter 1 when the Pharaoh gave a command to the midwives that they were to slay the male Hebrew children. We read in Exodus 1 that the midwives feared God and did not as the king of Egypt commanded. They disobeyed the king, and they disobeyed because they feared God. And then we read that God blessed the midwives because of their disobedience and gave them houses, that is, gave them homes and families of their own. In other words, God blessed that act of disobedience. Or we can think about Queen Esther as she violates the law of the land by going before the king without an appointment and says, if I perish, I perish. Or you can even think about Rahab when she disobeys the king of Jericho, when the king of Jericho bring up these people, these men that have come into the city here, bring them to me, and instead she hides them. So we see plenty of acts of people obeying God rather than obeying men and receiving God's blessing as a result. But again, we don't look for trouble and we don't look for martyrdom. I suggest that the hope, not necessarily the goal, but the hope of every Christian should be to die old, at home, in bed, at peace, surrounded by loved ones. And if God calls you to martyrdom, you follow his command. But it's not something you beg for. Well, let's take a break at this time and come back in 10 minutes, 15? Okay, sounds good.